Sometimes the dark side of fate just despises when human beings are relaxing or enjoying themselves. Take these fishing stories, for example. One second you're casting a line, and apparently the next, you might be reeling in the most disturbing moment of your life. Welcome back to Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails, and I'm here to share allegedly true stories of the unexplained from real people like you. And in today's episode, those stories are about scary things seen while fishing and during fishing trips. If you have a story of the unexplained, send it to me at darkstories.org. By the way, you can enjoy this podcast and more scary podcasts like it on Spotify, Apple, or your favorite podcast app by simply searching for EerieCast. Now, let's begin. If you see anything, say nothing. From Petrichor. For winter break one year, we packed up and headed to my hometown, a small island in West Asia that is not very well known. There I met my uncle. In fact, this is his encounter, not mine. He'd been at sea ever since he was just around 18. He was 35 when he first told me this. He's seen many things out there. And please do keep in mind that these are his words translated into English. This story is told from his perspective. Winter might be the worst time to be at sea. Even though here it is much warmer than other places, it still gets quite bad, especially for first-time fishermen. But the worst part is that it was squid season, and the deck smells terrible, no matter how much you clean it. Unlike Chinese vessels, we only stay at sea for 45 days, but that doesn't make it any better. Our position changes each time you sign up with the fishing company. But if you're new, it's possible that you were most likely to work as a cook or just cut squid. Regardless of all that, there was always one unsolicited rule. If you see anything, say nothing. That goes for anything out of the ordinary. Because legend has it, there are things that live in the sea that love to be talked about. Of course, when I was new, I didn't know that, but I wish I did. Beyond the deck being stinky, as was usual, when you get homesick as a newbie, trying to spot land makes you feel better somewhat. At least, that was my case. It was near sunset that day, as I recall, but it was already very dark. The deck always made me have a sour expression due to the stench. The sun was completely gone, and it was a little misty at the time. I was kind of frustrated with it all, to be honest. I just wanted to make some cash. At the start, I thought it would be easy. Just cook some food and cut some squid. Can't be that hard. That's what I always told myself before signing up. But there I was. I could only sigh and turn away to keep myself from puking from the smell. Then I heard something. I paused for a second, not sure of what I actually heard. It was like some kind of knocking. The kind of knock you'd hear when someone's in a hurry. I brushed it off as a crewman knocking on the door, even though I knew that knocking on metal doors sounded way different than that. It clearly sounded like hurried, wooden knocks. The knocks made me feel a little scrupulous, because each time I would hear 5 knocks, and when it finished, I thought it would be leaving or gone, only to start again. 5 distinct knocks, the last one always being the strongest. I was curious at the time to see what caused this strange noise. I feared it might be an issue with the vessel, but I wasn't really familiar with the mechanism and structure of it. I was careful not to get too close to the railing, just in case. I inched closer, trying to peek over the edge carefully. I then saw something in my peripheral vision. It didn't look exactly like a fish, but it did look fishy at the same time, if that makes sense. It had no scales, but somehow it looked like it reflected light. It was visible in the barely lit water. It was a distinct silver color, and its body was about 8 feet long. I thought it might have been a big fish of some sort, maybe a shark. But I was proven wrong. when I saw what was supposed to be its head. Its head was like a fox with no fur. And its limbs, they weren't tentacles or anything like that. They were human-like limbs, 4 of them. The thing gave off a smell like rusty iron. It was somehow worse than the smell of the deck itself, and I wanted to puke again. And this time, there was no holding it back. I grabbed the iron railing as tightly as I could and let it all out. The heaving made the walls of my stomach burn. I then heard a ringing in my ear. I don't remember what happened after that, but I do remember that the thing was gone next I looked. Now, I wasn't aware of the unspoken rules of these vessels, so as soon as I saw another crewman, I knew I had to pull him to the side and say something. He was an old man and had plenty of years of experience out at sea. I'll call him Ivan. Ivan was usually the captain during the squid fishing season, but he had recently had a head injury and could no longer do that anymore. But he still insisted that he accompany the vessel this season as well. The fishing company knew him well, and out of respect, they fulfilled his request. "Hey, man, I think I saw something," I said. He must have seen how pale I looked. He looked even more concerned. "What's up? You look like you're gonna wet your sheets tonight." Ivan was the kind to always joke, even in the most serious of moments, even if his jokes weren't funny at all. "Well, I saw something in the water. It was silvery and was huge, at least 8 feet. I told him, and he stopped laughing. I saw Ivan's expression harden. He was no longer smiling, no longer revealing his few missing teeth. He looked serious. "It's probably because you're new. Young ones especially tend to imagine things the first time. Just say your prayers and sleep for the night. But before that, find someone who's willing to do cooking duty instead of you." I wasn't imagining things, Ivan, and I've already said a prayer. I'm sure that I saw something in the water, something that wasn't normal. I tried to defend my claims against Ivan. I felt irritable for some reason. My stomach was hurting and growling now that it was empty, which made me even more annoyed. "Listen, I'm not saying you're lying. It's just, you look tired as heck." Ivan's usually friendly tone took a more deep turn. Then his expression looked as if he was scolding me. That night, I didn't feel like myself. All I could think about was that weird silvery thing in the water. No matter how much I tossed and turned in the bed, it didn't work. I just kept thinking about it over and over, and I was irritated at Ivan, a feeling of betrayal of sorts, even though Ivan didn't really do anything wrong. Now, in that vessel, we had no actual beds, just a couple of sheets under our bags, a sheet over us, and an old pillow. Each room was filled with 6 to 8 people, and to my bad luck, most of them were on duty that night and had come back smelling like squids, which is basically a smell of urine. The feeling of unease, combined with that stench in the room, made me get up from my sheets at last and walk towards the door, careful not to step on someone's arms or legs by accident and wake them up. I successfully made my way to the deck. There I found Ivan standing by the railing of the vessel, mumbling something that I could not hear. I didn't get too close to him, but he did stop and he looked at me. He continued to mumble as he did so. I could hear it better now. It was some sort of prayer, I think. Ivan looked fairly tired. His eyes were red as if he hadn't slept for days. I checked the water myself for the strange thing I saw earlier, as if I was eager or longing to see it again. "Are you looking for it?" Ivan stopped praying and looked at me, but his eyes were unexplainable, as if he were looking for something behind me, not looking at me. It felt as if I was dreaming. Ivan's bloodshot eyes snapped me awake then. I didn't say anything. I remember feeling a bit embarrassed, actually. I quickly ran back to the squid-smelling room. Something didn't feel right. It was as if everyone knew something and kept me in the dark. Hopefully, it was the last days of the squid season, so I wouldn't have to spend too much time with Ivan on the same vessel. Even during cooking duty, or any duty at all, I would avoid him as much as possible. I figured that I would no longer talk to Ivan, at least until we got back to land. But when we did, I was far too tired to do that. I tried not to think about the incident for a week or so. However, the day it came back to me, the day I needed to confront him and ask him about that night, was the day my mom shook me awake and said that old Ivan had died of a heart attack. Now, our island isn't too big. It doesn't have too many towns. It was only natural for people to know each other quite well. The old man, Ivan, was the first person to introduce me to the fishing vessel company, telling me it was the best way to get started with making money. And now he was dead before he could ever teach me much about the sea. On occasion, I think about the thing I saw back in the sea, but that wasn't the last time I saw it. Sometimes I still need money here and there, and I sign up for the same company. And every now and then, I do see that thing in the water again. Even if you see things that are unexplainable, it's important that you act like you never did and continue on with your duties. I finally then knew the unspoken rule of the vessel. If you see anything, say nothing. It changed us forever. From Mryeetusfeys. My dad and I never saw eye to eye. We'd always get into arguments about small things, and that would impact our relationship. Eventually, our mom would make us socialize. We set up a 3-day camping trip to a beautiful forest with a lot of mountains and lakes for fishing. We have a few things in common, and one of those things is fishing. We were certain that these lakes had some big fish. We said our goodbyes to our family and we set out to the camp. It took us about 5 hours to get there. But when we finally did, we were in awe of the scenery. It looked like the place had never been touched by people. Beautiful flowers all around, mountains just like the postcards. We soon walked down to the lake and we started to fish. We caught a big old bass and planned to eat it for lunch. When we got back, we set up camp in a clearing. We set up a tent, got a fire going, and had our truck only about 20 feet away. We started to prepare the dinner, the bass, and we noticed the woods at the time were completely quiet. We thought it was because we were here, so ignored it and continued on. When dinner was ready, we dug in. We were very exhausted and hungry from all that fishing a few hours before. Dinner was delicious. After that, we talked for a while. My dad even told me a few stories from his childhood. It was entertaining. Before long, we got sleepy, and we headed to our tent. After about 5 minutes, we were both out. In the morning, we set out to a certain place in the woods that had a lot of deer. We were amazed when we saw at least 5 deer at the spot. We ended up bagging 2 of them and planned to eat good for dinner that night. After a long day of hunting, we headed back to camp. This time, the woods were quite noisy compared to the night before. Again, we ignored it, cooking and eating our deer. Once more delicious. Eventually, we were back in our tent, asleep. At around midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps a few yards away from my tent. I looked over, seeing that my dad was awake as well. We were both groggy. We grabbed our guns to try and scare or kill the thing that had suddenly intruded on our camp. We soon found where the noises were coming from and began to crawl out of the tent and go in that direction. We lit up the place with flashlights. We saw nothing at first, but then our eyes began to make out a mass of fur. And then it began to move. We aimed our guns and fired. The sounds of gunshots almost deafened me. All of a sudden, that creature turned around, revealing itself. I was amazed it wasn't dead. It had hair missing in places and looked quite muscular. Too muscular to be a typical wolf. Its eyes had a red and yellow tint to it. It then stood on two legs and howled at us. The sound was so unnatural and wrong, and then it ran towards us. My dad, without warning, picked me right up off the ground and bolted towards the truck. We just hopped in, and thank God, Dad had his keys in his pocket. We threw ourselves in the truck, and my dad floored it. We could see the silhouette of the thing chasing us. It even threw a big rock at the cab. We sped until we saw a hotel, and only then did we finally stop. We rushed inside too, paying for a room quickly, and got settled in. It took forever for both of us to get to sleep. Come morning, we went back to the campsite. We found all our things mostly destroyed. Luckily, the important stuff wasn't touched. We packed up and sped away. When we got back home, we simply said our trip didn't go the way we planned. We never really did talk about that night since. However, my dad and I didn't fight as much anymore. We haven't shared this story with anyone else until now. What we encountered that night was anything but normal. Some things feel and look like a dream, but they turn out to be very real and very nightmarish. Out of Place, from Red Scarecrow 99. This story happened around 2021 in the summer. I live in northeast Pennsylvania, about an hour and a half drive to Narrowsburg, New York. It was a normal Sunday, and I had the day off. It had been a scorcher of a day, somewhere in the 90s, the kind of day where the energy was just ripped right out of your body, and the only ambition you have for the day is sitting near the AC. Fish are no different. Pro tip: if it's hot, sticky, and uncomfortable for you, don't even bother with a rod and reel. The fish feel the same way. They become very sluggish and usually hide deeper in the cooler water. I decided to wait and take the kayak out after dinner. The sun had begun its slow decline, and the shadows were getting longer by the second. The night brought with it cool air, and it was going to be a great evening of fishing. Or so I thought, because the fish forgot to RSVP to the party. Cast after cast was met with no bites, and I was about ready to head home as the sunlight dipped below the canopy. I turned the kayak toward the boat launch and started to paddle when I saw movement from the corner of my eye. It's not uncommon to see huge snapping turtles come up for air next to you, but this shape was alien, but not unfamiliar. 30 yards or so from my boat, I saw the dark shape of something long and slim, quite large, skimming the surface. Behind it was an S-shaped wake of waves as it lazily paddled in the same direction I was going. It was getting dark, so I couldn't see it clearly. Then it dawned on me where I'd seen it before. Countless documentaries flooded my mind where I'd seen alligators swimming, and this was what I was looking at. But this one was nearly the size of my 10-foot kayak. You better believe I kicked it into high gear, and I did my best Scooby-Doo bongo run. I'm pretty sure the kayak wasn't even touching the water, I was going so fast. What was it doing here, so far from its home range? Did somebody dump an illegal pet? And why was it following me? Questions with no answers. I got home and told my ex-wife about it. She wasn't happy and forbade me from fishing there. I called my friend in Fish and Game, and he told me that they'd actually taken a gator from that lake 2 summers before. That one was a 6-footer, and they even took a 4-footer from a neighboring lake. It was out of place, but not unheard of. I'm sure some of you in areas where crocodilians are common are laughing at me, and that's fair. But my fear was like experiencing a good 3 inches of snow while you're out on a drive. It can be dangerous and not so out of place. Tree Stalker from Wesley G. One time in Florida, a friend and I decided to go fishing one late evening at a nearby creek. It was in the woods behind our neighborhood. It was about an hour before dark, and these woods had a known history of devil worshipping and murder. But we grew up running around those woods and hunting in them. We knew them like the back of our hand, and the fishing was really good. We ended up out there for about 2 hours before heading back home. We were walking back home. At the time, we were 14 and it was a 30-minute walk. Out of nowhere, we began to hear this crashing sound in the trees. We looked up. There, I swear to you, we saw a black, humanish shape swinging towards us. We freaked out and began to run, armed only with fishing poles and machetes. As we ran, the thing in the trees began to make a roar or scream. It sounded like pigs being slaughtered and women screaming. I'll never forget that bone-chilling sound. We ran for our lives. About 3/4 of the way home, there was a small open field of tall grass, which was waist-high. The thing hit the ground from about 15 feet up and began to chase us on foot. But as it got closer to us in the field, it seemingly disappeared. We could see the tall grass parting as if something was there, but nothing was visible. We kept going and finally reached the hole in a 10-foot tall chain-link fence, which was just big enough for us to fit through if we crawled. Someone before our time must have cut it to gain access to those woods. One at a time we dove through it, then stood to run when that thing hit the fence behind us, bringing that section down. Then the noise and everything stopped. We didn't look back, we just kept running. We made it back to my place. We told my parents about it, but they didn't believe us. The night after, the entire neighborhood was outside at midnight, listening to a bone-chilling roar or screaming, the same kind we'd heard earlier. This lasted for about an hour. Later the next day, we took the adults to where it happened. Unknown to us on the path to our usual fishing spot, someone had drawn pentagrams on 6 trees, each at a point of a bigger pentagram on the ground, and we had mindlessly walked through it on our way to fish the first time, and we didn't notice. After that, those woods got much worse. Nowadays in that neighborhood, only one place is lived in, a single house, and no one really stays in it for more than a week. They claim it's haunted and dangerous. Hellhound from Lillyrunawaystar. One summer, my family and I decided that going camping would help the family, since my dad worked alone and couldn't spend a lot of time with me and my siblings. So we went camping in Tennessee. It was a good fall day. We'd rented an old camping site next to a river. They had some pedal boats docked in a small dock by the river. And fishing was my dad's favorite pastime, so this spot was important to him. My siblings, on the other hand, hated the outdoors. They were always on their phones and tablets, but me, I loved going out in the woods. I liked to sketch animals that would be still enough for me to sketch, and I would paint them later when I got back home. So the family settled up in some tents. My youngest sibling was to sleep with my brother, and my mom and dad had their own tent. I also had my own since I was 17. I worked at the time, so I could afford my own. We slept in the tents that night and woke up early in the morning. My dad went fishing while my mom and I went hiking. My siblings also went hiking but chose a different trail to go on, so it was just me and my mom. About a mile or so in, we stopped to eat some lunch, just 2 sandwiches. We finished around 12 minutes in and started to hike again. The birds were chirping and singing, and we heard various insects. But at a certain point, the forest grew dark and quiet, even though it was quite early in the morning. My mom even raised an eyebrow and spoke up. "That's odd." She went to check her phone, which was now dead. We didn't find it too surprising since my mom always forgot to charge her phone. So I checked my phone, and it was also dead. Okay then, now that's odd, I thought. But we continued on through the trail. As we walked, we felt something strange, like we were being watched or followed. At this time, my mom was pretty spooked out and wanted to go back to camp. I didn't, so I convinced her it was probably just a storm coming in. So we walked for another 2 hours. We soon got to our destination, an old beautiful waterfall. Even with it being as dark as it was at the time, it was still quite the sight. When we arrived, a few deer were drinking from the small river that the waterfall flowed into. It brightened our day, just for a little bit, until it began to get cold and we had to leave. We walked the same way back. My mom stopped about 2 hours back down the trail. "Did you hear that?" she said. "No. It sounded like a dog." We both got worried. My mom and I were animal lovers and didn't want to leave the dog out there, so we started to call for it. "Here, doggy," my mom was yelling, and so was I. We were looking around, but all we found was a collar on the ground. "Here, boy," I yelled. Suddenly, a large, massive dog came running out of the bush. I was startled and stumbled backwards, praying that I hadn't scared it, making it want to hurt us. It didn't. Instead, it sat there just looking at us blankly. My mom walked over and gently lowered herself down to me and the dog. It sniffed my mom's hand and began to wag its tail. She looked down at the torn collar. "Is that yours, boy?" my mom asked. This dog looked sick and skinny, so we did what any sane person would do. We took it back, and it stayed with us for the remainder of our stay. Dad even let us keep it. We took it to the vet. The vet said it was some sort of Great Dane mixed with a husky, due to its large size. She also said, besides it being really skinny, it was healthy. No parasites at all. That made us happy. We took it home and everything was fine for a few days. But I did notice it was getting way too attached to me. The poor dog would follow me around like a lost puppy. Well, I guess we did adopt him after all. But soon the dog began to snap at people, becoming really aggressive and protective over me. It got so bad we had to put him through a training program. But soon he got better. He was still very protective of me. I honestly didn't mind. It made me feel safe. But I hated leaving him for school. My mom said he would get really territorial over my room and would not let anyone inside it. And he wouldn't leave there either. But what I found weird is that he would never leave my side. After 4 months, he still wouldn't. He hardly ate, and he wouldn't even go to the bathroom on his own. He would just stare at me a lot too, like he was trying to communicate with me how much mental stuff he's gone through. It hurt my soul. I love him, yeah, but it is just sad. One night, there was a break-in. I was home alone. My mom and dad were off to do some things at my siblings' school. I was in high school, so I had to stay home. And oh God. That's the night I figured out what I would call him. The night he showed me his true self. His eyes had this deep killer look, and he was protecting me, like a German shepherd would its officer. The man who broke in had to go to the hospital. We found out later the guy was a single father, working 2 different jobs trying to take care of 4 kids alone. That's why we didn't call the cops on the dude. But killer would have killed the man if I didn't tell him to release him. But when he did, I swear that dog's eyes looked almost red. I could have sworn if he wasn't my dog, he would be something else entirely. But I know he loves me. Even if I think he's a hellhound of some sort, at least he's chosen to protect me. Fire on the Mountain. From Anonymous. I'm an outdoors guy. I can't remember a time when I wasn't out having a fire in the middle of nowhere, or fishing unnamed lakes in the woods. I'm accustomed to hearing wolves and coyotes at night, so wildlife never really bothered me. I was living in Kelowna, British Columbia at the time. The mountain wasn't very far from my house, maybe 30 minutes at best. There was snow on the ground. Was heading out on another fishing/camping trip. I normally tended to leave my keys in my unlocked truck when I knew no one else would be around. But this time was different. I remember walking from my truck through the trees to a clearing on the mountain with a view of the city. Once I got my fire going, I turned off my bright flashlight. I was having a good time listening to classic country and singing along. But then the hair on my neck stood up, and I knew something was out there. Like I said, I'm accustomed to wildlife, but it didn't feel like a bear, not a cougar, a coyote, or a wolf watching me. I turned on my light and put the light directly behind me. There were 2 blood-red eyes looking in my direction, about 100 yards away. I felt a sinking dread fill my body. I pressed the panic button on my keys so I could find my truck easier and follow the noise. I quickly grabbed my axe and my flashlight, and I ran back to my truck, shining my light in every direction to see if I could see who or whatever it was. Once I got back to my truck, I threw it in drive and sped off the mountain, still feeling that dread. I didn't feel safe until I got back home. The next morning, I went back to where the eyes had been. I knew where they were, as I'd been there before. When I made it there, I quickly checked my surroundings, looking for any sign of life from the previous night. I didn't see anything. No prints, no freshly broken branches. Not sure what it was. Not sure what kind of animal has red eyes like that. I didn't go back there again at night, because I'm afraid whatever that was might be closer. Umbagog Occurrence. From Larrence. I've been an avid fisherman for over 20 years, fishing everywhere from the piers of Santa Cruz, California, to remote lakes deep in the Adirondacks of upstate New York. But the creepiest thing I've ever experienced happened about 7 years ago, when I was fishing with my buddy Rob at Lake Umbagog on the border of Maine and New Hampshire. It was early October. The leaves were just starting to turn. Rob and I had rented a small cabin on the shores of the lake for a long weekend of fishing, hiking, and just getting away from it all. The first day went great. The weather was perfect and the fish were biting. We caught some nice brook trout and sat around the campfire that evening, sipping bourbon and telling tall tales. The next day, we decided to take the canoe out to this spot, about a mile up the lake, which a local had told us was a honey hole for big lake trout. It was a bit of a paddle and took us into the narrow finger of the lake, surrounded by steep, forested hills. The farther we went, the more silent and still everything got. At first it was peaceful, but then it was eerie. We finally reached the spot and started to fish. The action was a little slow, but we each caught a couple respectable 5 to 6 pound lakers. As evening approached, a dense fog started to roll in off the lake. We knew we should head back, but we were way too determined to land a real monster before calling it a day. Suddenly, I got a huge hit on my line. That fish fought like a demon, nearly pulling me out of my canoe a couple of times. After a 15-minute battle, it felt like, I finally got it up in the boat. It was a lake trout, all right, easily 15 to 20 pounds. But there was something very strange about it. I went to net it, and I noticed it had some kind of large amulet caught in its mouth, tangled in the lure. The thing looked ancient, like it was made of tarnished silver with strange symbols etched into it. When I tried to grab it, the fish gave a very powerful thrash and snapped my line, disappearing into the depths, taking the amulet with it. Rob and I sat there dumbfounded. We quickly packed up the gear and started to paddle for the cabin in the fading light and thickening fog. We were both kind of spooked. That amulet looked positively occult. About halfway back, we suddenly noticed another canoe, maybe 30 yards off to our left, just sitting there in the fog. We could make out the silhouette of a lone figure sitting in it, facing away from us. Rob called out, "Ahoy there!" But no response. We paddled a little closer, but the figure never moved or acknowledged us. The canoe looked very old-fashioned, almost like a dugout. As we passed within 10 yards of it, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I turned to Rob and saw his face had gone white as a sheet. He stammered, "That's not possible." I looked back at the other canoe, and to my utter disbelief, I could see right through the figure. It was translucent, ghostly, and though it faced away from us, I suddenly felt it was undoubtedly aware of our presence. A deep instinctual terror seized me. I started to paddle like a madman, as did Rob. Neither of us dared to look back until we reached the dock at our cabin. The ghostly figure and canoe were nowhere to be seen, but we didn't talk much that night. After a restless sleep, we packed up at first light and got the heck out of there, not even bothering to fish anymore. I did some research later on the history of Lake Umbagog, but I never did find any stories that might explain what we'd seen. I still fish, but I have not gone back to Lake Umbagog. Rob won't even fish from a canoe anymore. I think we'd both rather not know the full truth behind that apparition and the strange amulet we pulled from the depths. A Cajun's Encounter. From Backwoods Fisher. This happened to me and my cousin Jed about 5 years back. I still get goosebumps when I think about it. You see, Jed and I grew up fishing together in the bayous of southern Louisiana. We would spend countless hours in our John boat, exploring every nook and every cranny of the swamps around our hometown of Houma. We thought we'd seen it all. Gators to water moccasins to catfish the size of a grown man's leg. But nothing could have prepared us for what we encountered that muggy July night on Bayou Marmot. It was around 11 p.m. We were out gigging for frogs, something we had done 1,000 times before. The bayou was alive with the sounds of crickets, frogs, and the occasional splash of a gar or catfish. We had our headlamps on and were slowly cruising the bank, scanning for the telltale glint of frog eyes in the reeds. We'd been at it for about an hour when Jed suddenly grabbed my arm. "Luke, cut the engine. You see that?" He pointed to a dim light about 50 yards ahead, back in a narrow side channel that we'd never explored before. It looked like an old kerosene lantern just floating there in the dark. Now, we knew there were no other people crazy enough to be out in the swamp this late at night, and we sure as heck knew that lanterns don't just float in midair by themselves. But Jed, being the fearless, or foolhardy one, insisted we check it out. Against my better judgment, I agreed. As we slowly approached the light, I noticed the air getting colder, which was darn strange for a July night in Louisiana. The crickets and frogs had gone silent too. It was like the whole swamp was holding its breath. We got within about 20 feet of the lantern, and I could see it was one of those old-timey ones, like something straight out of the 1800s. It was just hanging there, defying gravity, its flame casting eerie shadows on the cypress trees. Jed reached out to grab it, and I swear to God, that thing moved. It drifted just out of his reach and began to bob slowly down the channel, like it was trying to lead us somewhere. Jed, of course, started to follow it. I hissed at him to come back, but he was transfixed. I had no choice but to trail after him. My heart was pounding by then. The lantern led us deeper and deeper into the swamp, into areas I'd never seen before, where the trees grew so thick overhead you could hardly see the sky. After what felt like an eternity, the lantern came to a stop in a small circular clearing. In the center of the clearing was an old, decrepit shack, the kind you might see in some voodoo film. The lantern floated right up to the door and just sort of winked out, like someone had blown out the flame. Jed, in a trance-like state, started to walk towards the shack. I grabbed his arm, trying to snap him out of it, but he shook me off like I was some sort of gnat. He walked right up to that door and opened it. I was a few steps behind him. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. Inside the shack, it was pitch black, except for a single candle flickering on a table in the center of the room. And hunched over that table was a figure, dressed in all black with a wide-brimmed hat. The figure slowly lifted its head, and I swear to all that is holy, that thing had no face. Just a blank expanse of skin where its features should have been. That was when Jed finally snapped out of it. He let out a scream that didn't sound human and bolted right out of the shack, nearly knocking me over in the process. The two of us ran like the devil himself was chasing us, crashing through the undergrowth, tripping over roots, splashing through the bayou. We didn't stop until we reached our John boat. We tore out of that bayou like a bat out of heck, and didn't speak a word to each other the whole way back to the landing. It was only when we were loading the boat onto the trailer that Jed finally spoke. "Luke, what the heck was that?" His voice was a bit shaky. I didn't have an answer for him then, and I don't now. We've never gone back to Bayou Marmot, and we don't talk about that night. But sometimes in the dark of night I still see that faceless figure in my dreams, and I wonder what would have happened if Jed had taken one step further into that shack. Or if I'd never decided to trail him. That's my story, and before you ask, no, we weren't drunk or high or nothing like that. What we saw was real, even if it shouldn't have been. Those swamps have secrets, old and dark ones, and sometimes when you go poking around where you shouldn't, those secrets tend to poke back. There's a reason I stick to fishing in the day now. The Umpqua Thing, from 3GAR3. It was about a decade ago, back when I was living in Oregon. I had a little cabin out in the Umpqua National Forest, near a spot called Toketee Falls. It was my slice of paradise. Just me, my dog Buck, and the great outdoors. I'd spend my days hiking and fishing in the North Umpqua River, just soaking in the peace and quiet. Now, I've honestly been a fisherman my whole life. I grew up with a rod in my hand, thanks to my old man. And in all my years of fishing, I've seen some strange things. Fish that I couldn't quite identify, weird sounds coming from the depths, those sorts of things. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what I encountered that autumn at Toketee Falls. It was late September, and the fall run of Chinook salmon was in full swing. These fish, let me tell you, they're monsters. Some of them push 50 or even 60 pounds, and they put up a heck of a fight. It's the kind of fishing that gets your blood pumping. I'd been out on the river since before dawn that day, hip deep in the icy water, casting my line into the churning pool at the base of the falls. I'd hooked a couple of beauties, but the big one, the king of the run, had eluded me so far. As the sun started to dip behind the trees, I decided to make a few more casts before finally calling it a day. That's when I felt it. A tug on my line. A tug so strong it nearly pulled me off my feet. I've hooked into some big fish in my day, but this was something else. It felt like I'd snagged onto a submarine. My reel screamed as the line peeled off of it. The rod bent nearly in half. I was sure it was going to snap at any second. But I've never been one to back down from a fight. So I set my heels in and started to battle whatever leviathan I'd hooked onto. We went back and forth for some time. It would take off on blistering runs, and I'd crank the reel to gain back line. Soon my arms were burning, and my back ached. But slowly, inch by inch, I started to win. Finally, I caught a glimpse of it in the frothing water. At first, I thought it was a log, but then I saw the tail fin, thrashing back and forth. This thing, whatever it was massive. Bigger than any salmon I'd ever seen. Bigger, in fact, than any fish I thought could exist in that river. I fought it a while longer, before I managed to bring it into the shallows. That's when I got a real good look at it. Folks, I've been fishing for more than half a century, and I've never seen anything like what I saw that day. It was shaped like a salmon, but that's where the similarities end. Its scales weren't silver, but rather a mottled gray-green, like the color of the river rocks. And its size, this thing was easily 8 feet long, and as thick around as a man's waist. But the most unsettling part was its eyes. They were too big for its head, and jet black, like 2 pieces of obsidian. And they had an intelligence in them that sent a shiver down my spine. That wasn't just some dumb animal. There was something ancient and knowing in those eyes, something that seemed to stare right into my soul. As I stood there, chest heaving, staring at this creature, it gave a sudden thrash. The line snapped like it was sewing thread, and the fish, if you can call it that, disappeared back into the depths of the pool. I stood there for a long time, just trying to process what I'd seen. I've never been a superstitious man, but there was something about that encounter that shook me to my core. There was a wrongness to that creature, a sense that it didn't belong in this world. In the years since, I've tried to find out if anyone else has ever seen anything like it, but I've come up empty. I don't fish at Tokati Falls anymore. In fact, I've never gone back to that part of the Umpqua River. I don't know what I saw that day. Maybe I don't want to know. The Man by the River, from Jane J89. I'd like to preface this by saying that, at the time, I didn't find this story spooky at all. My dad, on the other hand, certainly did. When I was 9 or so, my dad used to take me fishing quite a bit in the good weather. I'll admit I was never that much interested in fishing, but I did like being outdoors and hanging out with my dad. So I was happy to go with him. Tired of our usual catch of teeny-tiny sunfish and the occasional equally teeny-tiny perch, my dad picked a different fishing spot that day. Unlike the ponds I was used to, this was a river, and the fast-moving current splashed us both as my dad cast his line. We hadn't even been there an hour when I got bored with the fishing. Setting down my fishing rod, I began to climb around on the rocks in the riverbank, pretending to be a superhero of some sort, or maybe a marine biologist. I was an odd little kid, so it could have gone either way. I was checking to see if there was anything alive hiding underneath the rocks at the water's edge when I first saw the man. He seemed ordinary enough to me. Just a short, dark-haired man in what looked to me like normal fishing gear. It would be years later before it occurred to me that I'd only ever seen fishermen on television and movies dressed like that, and the clothes he wore were actually decades out of style. As a kid, it made perfect sense to me. He was a fisherman. He was wearing what fishermen wore. The only thing that seemed off to me at the time was that he was standing a few feet behind my dad, but they weren't talking to each other. My dad hadn't even turned around. He'd always been pretty friendly and loved to talk, so it was strange to me that he hadn't at least said hello to this newcomer. I was wondering why he was being so rude suddenly, when the man noticed me. Without so much as a word to my father, he quickly walked to the riverbank and waved me over. We were still only a few feet away from my dad then, so I figured I was safe to go see what he wanted. When I reached him, he crouched down to my level, and I found myself looking into the saddest pair of eyes I'd ever seen. This man looked like he was having the absolute worst day of his life. He didn't sound any happier than he looked. "You really shouldn't be playing so close to the edge, honey," he said somberly. "Those rocks are slippery. You could fall in, and it's awfully hard to swim in a current that strong. You could drown." I remember being a bit put out that a random stranger was telling me what to do, and that he had implied that my doggy paddle wouldn't be enough in the event that I fell into the river. Nevertheless, he was staring at me so intensely that I assured him I would stay away from the rocks, and I went to pick flowers instead. My dad came to find me a little while later, confused as to why I'd given up jumping around on the rocks. When I explained that the man had told me not to play there, he frowned. "What man are you talking about?" he asked. "The man who was standing behind you," I answered, obviously. Suddenly, Dad didn't feel like fishing anymore. He abruptly picked up all of our gear and led me back to the car. As he was loading everything into the trunk, he told me we had been the only two people by the river all morning. I tried to argue that there had been another man there, that I had even spoken to him, but he shook his head. "It's just been me and you, kiddo. Look, ours is the only car in the parking lot." He was right, of course, and whether he believed what I said or not, he quickly decided we could spend the rest of our morning together at the closest Tim Hortons instead. We never went back to that river. I don't know whether it was because my dad was spooked or because he just didn't catch anything there, but all of our subsequent fishing trips involved familiar ponds and little fish. I do know, however, that I never forgot the man by the river. Knowing now that children are more likely to experience the supernatural, I wonder if he had drowned in that river, or maybe he lost a loved one to the current, and he was spending his afterlife preventing others from making the same mistake. Regardless, I hope he has moved on by now, or at least found some peace. No one ought to be that sad for eternity. Attacked at Quetico Provincial Park. From Rapsconion. About 15 years ago, my brother, we'll just call him Steve, and I decided to take a trip up to Quetico Provincial Park in Ontario, Canada. We'd heard the fishing up there was incredible. Pristine lakes filled with monster northern pike, walleye, and lake trout. It was the kind of wilderness fishing we'd always dreamed of. We packed up our gear, rented a canoe, and set off into the park. The plan was to spend a week fishing and camping, really getting away from it all. For the first few days, that's exactly what we did. We paddled from lake to lake, setting up camp on the shore each night, cooking the fish we caught over the campfire. It was perfect. But on the fourth night, things took a turn. We had set up camp on the shore of a particularly remote lake, one that the park ranger had told us didn't get many visitors. It was a beautiful spot with crystal clear water and towering pines all around. We'd had a great day of fishing and were settling in for the night when we heard it. It was a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It started low, like a rumble, but it quickly rose into a high-pitched, almost metallic screech. It echoed across the lake, bouncing off the trees. Steve and I just sat there by the fire, staring at each other with wide eyes. "What the heck was that?" Steve whispered. I shook my head. We waited, hardly breathing. But for the time, the sound did not come again. After a while, we chalked it up to some weird acoustics, maybe a distant plane or something. We went to bed uneasy, still telling ourselves it was nothing. The next day, we decided to fish the far end of the lake, where a small river flowed in. We were hoping the change in terrain might mean even better fishing. We set out early, the morning mist still clinging to the water. As we neared the mouth of the river, I noticed something strange in the water ahead of us. It looked like a log floating on the surface, but as we got closer, I realized it was moving, and it was big, at least as long as our 17-foot canoe. Steve saw it too. "What is that?" he asked, his voice tight. Before I could answer, the thing disappeared beneath the surface, leaving a trail of bubbles. Steve and I exchanged a glance, unsure if we should continue. But the lure of big fish was too strong for us. We paddled on, a bit more cautiously. We fished the river mouth for a while with no luck. The odd thing was, we didn't see any signs of fish at all. No rises, no swirls, nothing. It was like that river was dead. We were just about to give up and head back when I felt a tug on my line. I gave a yell of excitement and started to reel it in, but immediately I could tell something was wrong. Whatever I'd hooked into was too heavy, way too heavy, and it wasn't fighting like a fish. It was more like I'd snagged a submerged log. But then the line started to move, cutting through the water in a straight line right towards the middle of the river. "Cut the line!" Steve shouted. But it was too late. In an instant, the thing changed direction and started coming right at us, the line spinning off my reel so fast it was smoking. Steve grabbed a paddle and started back-paddling furiously, trying to get us away. But it was no use. That thing burst from the water right next to the canoe, and I swear to God, I have no idea how to describe what I saw. But I'll try. It was like a giant eel, but with a head more like a crocodile. Its body was dark green, almost black, and it had to be at least 20 feet long. But the worst part was its eyes. They were yellow, with slit pupils like a snake, and they seemed to glow in an evil way. The creature lunged at the canoe, jaws snapping shut inches from Steve's arm. He yelped and swung the paddle at it, but it was like hitting a concrete wall. That thing didn't even seem to notice. I was still attached to the creature by my line, and it began to drag the canoe towards the center of the river. The boat was tilting dangerously, water slopping over the sides. I knew if we capsized, we were dead. This thing would tear us apart in seconds. In a moment of desperate clarity, I grabbed my knife and slashed at the line. It parted with a snap, and the creature disappeared back into the water, taking my rod and reel with it. Steve and I sat there in the rocking canoe, panting and shaking. We didn't speak a word as we paddled back to camp as fast as we could. We packed up our things with trembling hands and hiked away, not stopping until we reached the ranger station. We told the ranger we'd had an accident, lost some gear, but in the end, we didn't mention the creature. I mean, how could we? Who would have believed us? Thank you for tuning in to Unexplained Encounters. If you're not already, Follow and listen to Unexplained Encounters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Leave us a rating while you're at it. Get some cool creepy merch at eeriecast.store. Check out my other show where I narrate scary work stories. It's called Tales from the Break Room. For more terrifyingly entertaining shows from EerieCast, go to eeriecast.com. And if you want to listen to Unexplained Encounters and all the other EerieCast shows without pesky ads, sign up for EerieCast Plus at eeriecast.com/plus. You'll also get exclusive access to horror audiobooks only available to EerieCast Plus members. And you'll get 20% off our EerieCast.store merch through our members-only monthly discount code. Finally, if you have a scary story of the unexplained, send it to me at darkstories.org. I think that's about it. Thank you so much for joining us. Stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.